Okay, good afternoon. As we're continuing on, it's really time to start putting together the pieces for your final project. The final project is going to basically be an implementation plan or a pitch, you might consider it, for a data warehouse, enterprise data hub, a data system, a data integration system. One of these type of structures, that's really what that final project is about. So the week's deliverables, which we've been working on and what you'll work on coming in the future weeks here, are all kind of tying back to pieces that you're going to use inside of that final presentation. Now we have two main things that's going to be part of that final presentation. One is the action plan, and the other is the actual presentation itself. Now, you have complete freedom as far as templates of what you want to use. I have provided a couple of examples throughout the course, but you should not restrict yourself to say, this is what my template's going to be. I'm just going to simply fill in the gaps of the template. You have complete creative control in order to do that. So for example, let's talk about this week's assignment. Let me bring that on screen real quick. So for this week's assignment, we're talking about standards, why standards are important. As part of that, the actual assignment question which you're going to get, as you see here, week 9. So what you're going to do is you're going to develop a standard documentation. Um, what you need to do is think about that organization that you'd like to use for your final project. Now, it may be an organization in which you work, it may be one that you're familiar, it may be a fictitious one, but continue to try to find an organization or to use the one that you're going to use in your final project. So for this, it's about developing standards documentation. So what are the kinds of things that you'd want to have documented and standards? One example, not the only example, one example would be what's the naming conventions for your particular items. So that would be one. You want to have your developer teams all calling the fields the same name. Now you don't need to develop a 30-page document, complete, holistic, showing all of the different naming conventions. Give a sample. So like one student had asked, and she'd produce something really simple in an Excel spreadsheet or a Excel table. And in that table, she said basically, these would be the naming standards that I would enforce. It'd be like a customer, it'd be like the customer's full name, etc. And she had quite a few specifically tied back to her organization. That's the key thing. If you turn in something that's one page that just has like the 3 examples that I have here, that's not going to get you any points whatsoever. So think about your organization, think about producing a standards documentation, i.e. one would be like naming conventions, there'd be other standards that you'd want to have. So any of that you'd like to put together, that's for this week's assignment. It's a relatively straightforward one. Think about it's going to have to be at least 4 pages in length, so consider what's the kinds of things that you'd want to put into that. Like a table showing naming conventions would be one specific item that's out there. Maybe table naming conventions. Maybe what domains that you'd like to have inside of your database, standardizing those. Those would all be things that you could put into this. There's no template. Again, probably the most common way to solve for this is to use like an Excel spreadsheet and then take that table and transfer that over to a Word document. Again, remembering APA format. Now, this shouldn't have any citations, so a work citation page would be optional in this particular case. So now let's say we've got our standards document that's all produced. You've got this week's assignment. Well, that's one of many weeks of assignments you'll all stack together to produce the action plan. Here's an example of an action plan, and again, you should see that. I believe it's in week 12 is where this is shared. I'll be happy to share that out too as well in the announcement, just so you have a copy of this. This is the plan that you're going to put together, and as you can see looking on the right-hand side, you can kind of see there's major components from different deliverables which we've completed and deliverables which we will complete. So you talked about external data. You talked about unstructured data in some of your previous assignments. You talked about the operational data store and whether that makes sense for your particular design. You talked about specific types of warehouses, exploration, data mining, distributed. You talked about Hadoop systems, for instance. We talked about web system interaction. We talked about about the technology concerns that you may have. As you can see, these are all sections within your action plan. So the things that you've completed previously, they will all be things that you would drop into this final plan. Now let me just quickly spin down through and show you some of the individual pieces. So things like an executive summary, explain what your company's about and what you're trying to do as part of this. Give it just a couple of paragraphs there, saying specifically what your design is about and specifically what you're asking for. Now we'll get into a little bit more of the details of that part of it later in the course. What's the specific reasons for this? What's the benefits? What's the cost-benefit analysis, etc.? What's some of the main data elements that you'd want to have? So again, that's really coming into this week's assignment. What kinds of things would you want to have as far as the data requirements? What kind of design would you use? And then what kind of functional components? Would it have external data? Would it have unstructured data? Do you need an operational data store, etc.? You would then have reference to these checklists that you're making, like a data modeling checklist, a naming standards checklist, the data quality and compliance plan, which we'll get into in future weeks. You're going to have a design that you're actually going to produce, showing kind of a physical design, a logical design for your particular implementation. In this case here, it's a simple data warehouse, a very simple type system. It shows some of the feeds that come into it, some of the data marts that you're going to build out of it. And then the final section here will be talking about the cost pieces of it. And again, we'll get into that a little bit later in the course. That's what the action plan is going to look like. And then what you're going to do is you're going to turn that into a presentation. So here's an example of a presentation. And in this presentation right here, you're going to basically, oops, my screen is not going to cooperate. Let me go ahead and minimize this over here. Okay. So in this, you're going to basically walk through saying, this is my project. And again, I'm just using this kind of an example here to show you. I would explain a little bit about my company. That would be something that you would start off with. Your organization, what's kind of the context that you're doing this in. Give a problem statement. Give the specific goals of what you're trying to achieve. Talk about the benefit analysis. What's the reason for doing this? Why is the reason why you're asking for funding as part of this? What's some of the requirements? What's some of the business requirements that go along with it? Who are some of the stakeholders? What's some of the roles and responsibilities? What kind of a cost and schedule type of estimate have you put together for this? If it's a pilot, it would be one type of a cost estimate. If it's an actual implementation, it would be another. And so you may even want to break it up into phases. What's the technical design? What does that look like as part of this? What's the kinds of things that you're included? What's the kinds of things that you're not going to include inside of your design? What's some of the technology pieces that you're going to want to include? What's some of the checklists that you have, such as data modeling, the naming standards, the data quality, etc.? What's some of the cost estimates? How would they break out by individual areas, for instance? And we'll go over this later in the course. And then what's your final recommendation? So think of this as you're an executive, you're pitching this idea back to your organization, and the end result is you're going to ask them for approval, saying, based on this, I see the need to improve, I see the need to build out a brand new type of data integration system, data warehouse, data lake, etc., and I'd like to ask for X number of dollars in order to do this. These are kind of the two end deliverables which you're going to be working towards. So that action plan that we saw first, as well as that presentation. How you build that action plan out, that's the individual pieces which we're working on over the weeks. Each of those kind of go into this piece here, and then the final presentation will be the final summary of all of those pieces into the final pitch. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into where this is going and what's the kinds of things. But this is not, you take the template, you fill in the parts of the template. Your action plan may and should probably look very different than what I've shown you here. But this gives you kind of a base example. If you're still kind of trying to sort out why are we going through some of these pieces, this gives you a base example of how those pieces all fit together. So I thought that that might be some valuable to you. If you still have questions, again, we have office hours this evening at 7 o'clock Eastern. Please join us for office hours and we'll work through that. Otherwise, If you have any other questions, help desk forum, reach out to me directly, or we'll continue to have these conversations. We'll continue to share these types of things. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, bye.